Hello, friends. Pastor Ron here, and I'm excited to do session 4 for hospital visits. And I just want to preface my comments by saying, these videos are really for every member of our congregation because everybody in our church is going to be impacted by a hospital visit or you will be a hospital patient. And so we can all learn something from this. So I would encourage you that if you hadn't thought about watching these videos, that you might just sit down with a notebook and a pen and maybe take down some good notes. Anyway, today I want to talk to you a little bit about what we should do and maybe what we shouldn't do when visiting a patient. And the first one is this, and you may want to write this down. Stay with the patient until completion. And what I mean by that is that when you're visiting the patient and, for example, and they're having a test or a procedure, you might want to stay until you have heard the completion of that test or how that procedure went. If it's a minor procedure, kind of in and out kind of thing, like same-day surgeries, that can be a little bit different. But even then, I would kind of pay real close attention to especially to the family member that is there and how they're reacting to what is occurring with their loved one. So, be that in mind, because the family member oftentimes will give us clues about how long we should stay. And if we hear them say things, maybe repeatedly, like, thanks for coming today, that's usually an indication that it's maybe time to go and have a word of prayer before you leave. But also, I think by staying oftentimes, especially with a more major type of procedure, it can add an extra element of support to the family member who is there visiting or staying with their loved one. And when the medical personnel inform the patient that they're out of surgery or they're out of a test, that might be a good time for you to excuse yourself and leave with a prayer, or if that's not applicable at the time, just to wish them the very best by God's grace and care. And that's a time that you can leave the patient and also, by the way, I wouldn't stick around so often to think about visiting the patient because after they come out of surgery, they probably won't remember anything you said anyway. And if it's a life and death situation, I would kind of prefer if you would call me, at least try to reach out to me so that I know what's going on. And I may feel the need to join you at the hospital or some other medical facility because those can be very traumatic times. But it's also important that it is a much needed support for the family. And I should tell you that I have had, by God's grace, numerous opportunities actually to lead people to Christ on their deathbed. And that is always such an honor, and I'm humbled by that. So you never know how God's going to work through you in those situations. So, number 2, it's important for you to be an advocate for the patient and the families. There will be at times that you will need to go out of the room and find another medical personnel because the patient you're visiting may need to go to the restroom. They may need an extra pillow or blankets, and maybe nobody knows where they're at. There's none available in the room. So you might go find a medical personnel and ask them, where do I find an extra blanket, a pillow, whatever it might be. Or they don't have any more water in their glass. I prefer that you don't get the water, but that you would be able to find someone to help you with that. It might mean a simple thing, but I just caution you about doing things that are maybe beyond what is really necessary and that may impact that person's recovery time. And another thing is important to be an advocate when the doctor comes in, if they come in while you're there. You can ask the doctor if it's okay to stay. I would prefer you do that. Or to ask them, would it be best if I left the room for now? And they'll tell you one way or the other if you can stay or leave. But then if you're going to stay, I would at least mentally in my mind take notes what you're hearing from the doctor as he's interacting with the patient. Because oftentimes after the doctor leaves, this is a good time to sit down with them and say, why don't you tell me what you heard the doctor say to you today? And that will give a great insight into how they perceive the doctor explaining their situation and how you might fill in and help that patient interact with the doctor. And here's what I mean by that. Doctors are busy and they're usually in the room and they're out of the room, but oftentimes there's other medical people that are around the area there. And if the doctor's left and the patient has some confusion about some issues, that would be a good time for you to go talk to somebody, one of the nurses, and say, the person I'm visiting had some questions for the doctor, and I know he was busy. Could we have a chance to talk about some of the concerns my patient has? And oftentimes, when I'm there before the doctor arrives, or even someone who's going to a clinic just for a visit to a primary care physician, I encourage them I take a piece of a 3x5 card, and I write down questions that I want to ask the doctor. So when I walk into their office, I have that card in front of me, and I have the 3, 4, 5, 6 questions that I want to be addressed that particular day. And it's interesting when you do that, I think it slows the doctors down a little bit, because then they start paying attention to the actual facts as they're being given to them and the concerns that you might have. So if you're doing it for somebody else that's in the hospital, that's a great way to minister by saying, how about if we come up with some questions that you might have for the doctor as he comes to make his rounds today? And you can write those down, and even if you're not there, you can leave that piece of information on the tray table, so when the doctor comes in, he has access to that. So that's one of the ways that you can be an advocate for people when they're in a hospital or a rehab center, for example. And the other one is to ask probing questions. Because here's a common question that people get asked: how are you feeling? I mean, it's natural because we all want to know how the patient is feeling. But how about if we took it to a little bit deeper level and say something like this: I think I would feel overwhelmed at this point in my hospital stay if it resembled you. I think I'd feel overwhelmed at this point in your hospital stay. And here's the clincher, and this is something that I learned when I was a rapid response chaplain for the Billy Graham Association. They preferred their chaplains on field to ask this question, not how you're feeling. By the way, my main area of focus was on mass shootings and police officer, firefighter fatalities, but that was my main focus. But they encouraged us to ask people, family members or people that were around the tragedy, how are you holding up? Or a question I just asked somebody the other day, I said, what would you like Jesus to do for you today? Now that seems like kind of a simple question, but it's not when you think about it. You're asking the Son of God, God, this is what I need from you today. And you know what? He wants to hear that from you. He wants to know what your needs are. And so I just say to people, and I ask them, what would you want Jesus to do for you today? And they'll tell me. And that is sometimes, no, not sometimes, actually most of the time, is my basis for how I'm going to pray for that person before I leave. Or another question you might want to ask them is this: what are you praying for right now? And the flip side of that is that it goes like this: how can I pray for you right now? Another question you might ask is, how are you doing with all of this? How are you doing with all of this? And another question I might ask them, and this, I pay attention to the room, and I want to encourage you to do that. Be observant of the room. When you go in there, if you don't see cards, you don't see anything that indicates you've had visitors at all, I ask them, have you had any visitors? And that is a clue to maybe something that might be going on, that they may, I mean, seriously, they might feel like, nobody cares, nobody's come to see me. I haven't received a phone call, I haven't received a card. So pay attention to things like that. That's really important. And most of the time, your questions will come from the conversations that you're having with the patient. So you need to learn to listen carefully to what they are saying and even do reflective feedback. What I heard you say was, it seems to me that what you're saying to me is this, and then let them fill in the blanks. Number 3, don't claim to be an expert. By the way, when you visit somebody in the home, in a rehab, in a medical facility, it's not your job to solve the problems or to answer all the questions they might have. But they may reveal things. They may say something to you, well, I need transportation home from the hospital. I need meals brought to my house because won't be able to take care of my meal needs. I need somebody to come and clean my house or to run some errands for me. And then learn when you're there too to connect with the social workers if you need be, and case management specialists. And if you need to, when you come to the nurse's station and you visit the patient and these needs come up, it's okay to go back to the nurse's station and say, you know what, I was talking to this patient I was visiting today and they have some concerns about this. Do you think it's possible for us to meet with one of the caseworkers or a social worker? Because usually they are the ones that are working out the discharge plan for when they get home. So I think it's really important to do that. And then you might even ask the patient if you go to the hospital and you visit them and they say, well, the social worker is coming today and they're going to be here at 11 o'clock and you're there at 10:30, let's say, for example. It would be okay for you to ask them, would you like for me to stay while you're having this conversation with the social worker or the case management specialist? And they will tell you, nah, that's okay, you can go. Or they may say, oh, I'd love for you to stay. I'd like to hear from you what they're saying to me. And that's just another way of being just a great advocate for our people. And number 4, never force prayer. Please ask if you can pray for them. And I feel very strongly about that because the patient is at a very vulnerable place in their life. And you know what? It's their space, it's their room, it's their condition. And I think that by asking permission, you're allowing them to have what little control they have of their life. Because listen, and you know as well as I do, when you're in a hospital or in a rehab, it's no longer your life. It's really somebody else telling you when and how and where you're going to go, and all those are connected with your care and your health. This is an opportunity for them to hear from somebody that, you know what, you're giving me a little bit of control of my life again. So ask them if you can pray for them. And they may say no. I've rarely had that happen, but it seems like I have. Or they may say this, yes, you can pray for me, and I would appreciate it if you would put me on the prayer chain. And that's great. But what I do want to emphasize is, please do not notify the church office and put somebody on the prayer chain unless they have given you even verbal permission to do so. If you do, and they haven't given you permission, you're violating HIPAA regulations. Now, another line that I want to talk to you about prayer is they may ignore your suggestions for prayer. They may ignore your thoughts about prayer because, for one thing, they're not feeling well. Or they may even be upset with God. And that's okay. God's big enough, He can handle the anger. But forced prayer is though somehow or another we have a personal agenda of going in this room and making it all about me. And I've decided I'm going to pray, and I'm going to pray the way I want to pray, is really can do more damage and can leave the patient with ill feelings about your visit. So don't force issues, don't force prayer, or don't even force people to talk about their relationship with God. That's not your position at this time. If that opportunity arises, you'll know it. You will know it. And here's the other thing, most of our patients today, it's changed a lot. Patients are rarely anymore, it seems like, in the hospital more than 2-3 days at the most. So we usually only have like that one moment when we're there. So we want to make good use of that time. Okay, number 4, I think it is. Don't be afraid to show your emotions. Listen, you and I are human beings. God has created us as emotional beings. And there will be times you might be visiting somebody in their home after a celebration of life, or something tragic has happened, or at the hospital. And there will be times that you will visit with somebody at the hospital or at home, and just their story will impact you emotionally. And yes, it may bring you to tears. Just, and that's okay. Just be careful not to make the tears about yourself. But shedding tears with a patient and their family can build a strong relationship. Wow, think about this. What did Jesus do at the tomb of Lazarus? He shed tears. He shed tears over the pain and the hurt and the sorrow that his friends and other people were experiencing over the loss of his friend Lazarus. So it's natural, but just be careful with it, that you're not making your tears a place of show or making it about yourself, but you're doing it in such a way with very gentleness and tenderness to show the people and the family that you really genuinely love and are concerned and care for them, and you're empathizing with them, you're sympathizing with them. That's so important. And then next, don't interrogate the patient. If I had one problem I have with people in prayer chains is this, in my pastoral experience over the years, is my secretarial staff would come to me and say, you know, Pastor, so-and-so called and they want to know about so-and-so and they want to know all these details. And I tell people, this, that God knows exactly what those details are. He knows exactly what is occurring and what he wants to do in the life of the patient. And that's what's important. We don't need to know everything because God does, but we can still intercede on behalf of people given the information that they've allowed us to experience and to know. And please resist the urge to ask, and along with that, if they've tried some kind of a medication, over-the-counter medication, a CBD product, or some kind of a treatment plan that worked for them. Well, just because it worked for you doesn't mean it's going to work for them. That's a doctor's decision. And just don't ask a million questions. Actually, I think that when people are sort of asking a lot of questions and probing and probing and probing, they're displaying a self-focused approach to ministry. Most people, I find, want to ask questions or control conversations because that's what they want to be. They want to be in control of the situation. They want to be in control of what's occurring between you and the person that you're visiting. And here's the second one, and I'm telling you, this is so important. A lot of people are uncomfortable with silence. So how we fill, we used to call it in radio, we fill airspace. You can't have dead airspace on a radio. Well, you can have dead airspace in a hospital visit, or a home visit, or a rehab visit. Like the song went years ago, I remember even saying it, silence is golden. Well, silence can be very golden. It can be a very powerful, powerful tool that God will use to minister not only to the patient, but to you. So learn to be comfortable with silence. I remember one time when I was teaching one of my seminary students or classes, and I asked them, I said, you know what I want you to do? I don't want any questions. I don't want anybody talking. And I'm going to time you for 1 minute. Nobody's going to say a word. And when I got done with that experience, they felt like it had been 10 minutes. And I say, listen, when you get into ministry and you're dealing with people, you're going to have those minutes of silence to regroup and to rethink and reanalyze what's occurring with you and the person you're ministering to. So learn to be comfortable with silence. Next, don't question your faith. I heard John Ortberg say this the other day. Every one of us has a story to tell about our journey with God. And the marvelous thing I think was so beautiful about it is that Our stories are different. Your story is different than my story. And people in hospitals are learning more about trusting God perhaps than anybody else at that time. And contrary to what you and I may see and hear from other church leaders or pastors, especially on television, that teach this whole idea that a belief in God automatically means divine healing. Well, that's just not biblically true, for one thing. And I heard about a patient who was always told, when somebody come to visit him, you have to trust God, you have to keep the faith. And then this person said, I wanted to tell those people, what do you think I'm trying to do? I'm trying to trust God. I'm trying to hold on to my faith. That's a time to minister to them, not to question them. Please never question the faith of a patient while visiting them. That's just not the time and the place for that. In fact, I'm not sure there's a time and a place for that at all, except when you're alone with them, maybe down the road, and you know them real well, and you ask questions, why don't you tell me about your story with Jesus? See, there's ways of introducing that without being critical or forceful or know-it-all. So just be mindful of that. Next, don't belittle medical staff. I just said a few minutes ago, you need to be an advocate, and that can be important too. But that doesn't mean speaking poorly of the medical staff, the doctors, the clinicians, and other hospital staff. Remember, after you leave the hospital, the nurses, the doctors, the cleaning personnel, and other professionals are left to care for that patient. And if you leave that patient because you've interjected your thoughts and your ideas, and hear me out on this, you will encounter people laying in a hospital bed that are really upset with the medical staff and everything. I understand that, but it's not your place to criticize them. Please don't do that. You do not want to be in the middle between the medical people and a patient should that information be found out. I just encourage you, I would say something like this, I'm sorry that you're feeling that way. I know this is a very difficult and trying time in your life. So how would you feel if we prayed about it and then leave it at that? And really, it's up to the spouse or some other person who is a significant other in this individual's life to take it the next step. And really, it's the patient that needs to do it. Now, you can be there with them, can help them ask, like I said, write questions down and support them, but don't belittle hospital staff. Please don't do that. Next, don't assume you understand. And I have brought this up in the past, and I think I've framed it a little bit different, so it's going to sound a little different today. Just because you might have had cancer, a broken hip, a broken arm, broken leg, or some other kind of illness, even COVID, for example. We all were affected by COVID differently. It doesn't mean that you understand what this patient is dealing with. Because your cancer, your broken hip, your flu, or some other illness doesn't make you an expert in everyone else's medical condition. Never, and I repeat, never, ever say, I know how you feel, because you don't know how they feel. No one can understand your pain, your grief, your fear, your anxiety. So why would you think that you can understand someone else's? If they can't understand you, they aren't going to understand, you can't understand somebody else. Instead, you can ask a probing question that sounds something like this. If I were you, I might feel scared. That communicates that you're trying to put yourself in their shoes. You're trying to empathize with them. You're not just giving them advice that you think they need. Never assume that you understand what they need, because oftentimes you don't. And then don't assume that you know what God is going to do for the patient. And I can tell you, I've had this happen quite a number of times. I'll say it that way. And actually, I've made mistakes with this. I confess that to you right now. I made the mistake that a person is about to die. I've been told that by the hospital staff. The families have been given an update on the information. They don't expect the person to live through the day, much less through the night. And guess what? They've recovered and lived many years afterwards. And the reverse is also true. I've had situations where I visited somebody and gosh, they were on the road to recovery. They were making plans to go home and to be with family, to pursue some of the things that they were enjoying before all this illness or injury happened. In fact, when they left the hospital or the clinic or whatever it happened to be, they were given a clean bill of health only to die a short time later. So you can never pretend to know what God's will is for a person. Now, that's really just my technical stuff today. I'm sure you're glad of that. But I do want to bring this up, and this is really exciting for me. You know, I had mentioned some time ago that I really would like to have us wear name tags, and there's a reason for that, because there's a lot of people walking in and out of hospitals, and I have to admit to you, Tucson hospitals are a lot more lenient than the hospitals that I'm used to working with. They give us a lot of latitude about visitation that in other hospitals that I've worked at or even been a pastor to visit my own parishioners wouldn't allow you to do. And one of them is that I've always felt like it's important that the personnel that are working there knows who is coming to visit this patient and why they're even in the hospital. And most of the time it's really for a security risk. I can tell you history about that. I have had encounters where people pretended to be a clergy and came walking in the hospital and just started walking down the hallway, tapping on people's doors and going in and visiting them in their room. And they weren't their pastor and they had no business being even in the hospital. So we decided, or I should say maybe I decided, that I wanted to have some name tags. Now, some of you already have a church name tag, and I'm okay with that, so that's fine. But if you'd rather have something a little bit different, this is a little name tag that Denise was so kind to make up for us. It's called Visitor Evangelical Free Church. So that tells that you're a hospital, that you're a visitor, but that you are representing the Evangelical Free Church. And then on the inside, I ordered these wallet cards. And what they are is they are hospital visit tips. And they are kind of like always do something. Like, for example, always call ahead for room numbers. Go to the hospital or the facility, sanitize your hands, sit down, just listen, keep it private, keep it short, stay until it's over sometimes be their advocate, sometimes ask deep questions, sometimes refer to another professional. Then there's a do not list on the back side of that. So we're going to have, Pat and I are going to have these out in the fellowship hall Sunday. They'll be out there Sunday where you can pick them up. And these will be a kind of a neat thing for you to keep with you when you go visit. In fact, I want to encourage even all of you who do home visits that you take that with you as well, because there are people in our church, and Pat and I just found this out a couple weeks ago. We didn't even know they belonged to our church. And so they needed to know who we were. But anyway, this would be just a great tool for you. So even if you're visiting somebody in their home or you're going to a rehab center, please wear a name tag. And if you don't want to wear this one, I understand that, except I would prefer you would, because that card is in there just to kind of remind you a little bit about what you should say, what you shouldn't do. And anyway, we'll make these available for you on Sunday. You can pick them up then. So anyway, thank you so very much. I hope you enjoyed this session, and God bless you, and just have a great summer.